October 23rd, 1991, San Diego, California. Inside a conference room at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America, a Boston University geologist named Robert Schoch stood in front of a room full of his peers and said something that made the entire hall go silent. He told them that the Great Sphinx of Giza was not built 4,500 years ago. He told them the stone itself proved it was thousands of years older than anyone had ever dared to suggest, and that the accepted history of Egypt, the timeline taught in every textbook on the planet, was wrong. People in that room did not know whether to laugh or to panic. Geologists began flipping through his slides looking for the flaw. Archaeologists in the audience felt their careers tilt sideways. Because if this man was right, then everything built on the assumption that civilization began in Egypt around 3000 BCE was standing on sand. For 30 years, that claim has refused to die. It has been argued over, mocked, defended, and investigated again and again, and it has never been fully settled. And now in the last few years, something new has been thrown into that old argument. People started feeding the evidence, the scans, the erosion data, the astronomical measurements, into an artificial intelligence called Grok, built by Elon Musk's company xAI, and asking it the one question nobody could ever agree on. Who actually built the Sphinx? What came back did not put the argument to rest. It reignited it. Picture the Sphinx the way it actually sits on the Giza Plateau today. 73 meters long, 20 meters tall, carved directly out of a single ridge of limestone bedrock, rather than built up from blocks like the pyramids beside it. It is the largest monolithic statue on Earth, and for most of its life, it has been half buried in sand up to its shoulders, only fully excavated in the 20th century. Its face stares due east, fixed on the horizon where the sun rises, and it has held that gaze through the rise and fall of every dynasty of pharaonic Egypt. Through Greek occupation, through Roman rule, through the Islamic conquest, and into the modern age of drones and laser scanners. The official story, the one accepted by the overwhelming majority of Egyptologists, places its construction firmly in the reign of the Pharaoh Khafre, who ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty from roughly 2558 to 2532 BCE. In this account, Khafre's workers were quarrying limestone for his pyramid complex, the second Great Pyramid at Giza, and left behind a natural outcrop of bedrock, too irregular to use for building blocks. Rather than discard it, they carved it into a reclining line with the face of their king, a guardian standing watch over his tomb for eternity. This is not a fringe opinion. It is the mainstream, well-evidenced position held by leading Egyptologists, such as Mark Lehner, who has spent decades mapping and excavating the Giza Plateau, and Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former chief of antiquities. Their case rests on real physical context. The Sphinx sits directly in line with Khafre's pyramid and valley temple, built from the same quarry using matching construction techniques and tool marks. A granite and limestone temple beside the Sphinx, called the Sphinx Temple, uses stone blocks that appear to be the very blocks quarried out of the Sphinx enclosure itself, meaning the digging that shaped the Sphinx's body directly produced the material used in a 4th dynasty structure standing right next to it. And more than 1,000 years after Khafre's death, around 1401 BCE, the Pharaoh Thutmose IV had a granite slab known as the Dream Stele placed between the Sphinx's paws, describing how the monument appeared to him in a dream while he napped in its shadow during a hunting trip, and asked him to clear away the sand burying it up to its neck, promising him the throne of Egypt in return, and referring to it by the name Hormaket, meaning Horus in the horizon, an ancient image of the sun god rather than a portrait of Khafre by that later point in history. To mainstream archaeology, this is a closed case. A pharaoh, a workforce, a quarry, a matching temple, a documented restoration 1,000 years later. Simple, coherent, and dated. It is also worth knowing that Mark Lehner did not start out as a defender of this timeline out of blind loyalty to convention. Early in his career, he actually lived for years in a rented room close to the Sphinx while working with a research group connected to the psychic Edgar Cayce, who had claimed the Sphinx concealed a hidden hall of records from a lost civilization. Lehner went looking for evidence to support that idea, and instead spent so long mapping the plateau stone by stone that he became one of the world's leading skeptics of any date earlier than Khafre, precisely because the physical context kept lining up with the 4th dynasty, rather than with anything older, except the stone itself does not agree. This is where the story stops being simple. If you walk down into the deep trench carved around the Sphinx's body, the pit that was dug to free it from the surrounding bedrock, and you actually look at the walls, you find something that should not be there if the official story is complete. Egypt is a desert. It has been a desert for roughly 5,000 years, since a period called the Neolithic subpluvial, sometimes referred to as the Green Sahara, drew to a close, and rainfall across North Africa dropped off almost entirely. In a desert climate, exposed limestone weathers in specific, well-understood ways, Wind-blown sand produces a horizontal scouring, a directional pitted texture like sandpaper dragged sideways across the stone for centuries. Salt crystallization, caused by groundwater wicking up through porous limestone and evaporating, leaves a crumbling, pockmarked decay as the salt crystals grow and fracture the rock from inside its pores. What you find on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure is neither of those signatures. Instead, there are deep, rounded, vertical channels, undulating waves that run down the face of the rock, narrower and softer near the top, and wider and deeper toward the bottom. Exactly, the pattern water carves into stone as it runs downhill under gravity over long stretches of time, gathering volume as it falls. Not a single flash flood, not one storm. The patient, repeated work of actual rainfall, season after season, for a very long time. The person who first raised this in print was a French scholar named René Achwaler de Lubitsch, who wrote about the odd weathering back in 1961, though at the time it was treated as a curious aside rather than a serious geological claim. It was picked up more forcefully in 1979 by the writer John Anthony West, who argued in his book Serpent in the Sky that the erosion pointed to a construction date as early as 15,000 years before the Common Era, tied to Nile flooding from a much wetter climate. West took his idea to Robert Schoch, and the two of them traveled to Giza together in 1990 to examine the enclosure walls directly. What followed was that packed room in San Diego in October 1991, where Schoch formally presented findings that placed the primary carving of the Sphinx enclosure somewhere between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 BCE, based on the depth and profile of the erosion channels and on rainfall weathering rates measured in other limestone structures of known age. It is worth being completely straightforward about where this stands today. The Sphinx water erosion hypothesis has never been accepted by the mainstream archaeological or geological community. It is formally classified as a fringe position. Critics, including Hawass, have pointed out that similar rapid flaking and erosion can be observed today on nearby tombs of confirmed Old Kingdom date, such as the tomb of a noble named Debehen close to the Sphinx enclosure, meaning the same soft limestone layer can degrade quickly under modern conditions, through simple humidity, temperature swings, and modern groundwater rise, without requiring 10,000 years of ancient rain to explain it. Geological bodies, including the very society Schoch presented to have never endorsed his redating. And there is a real, unresolved absence sitting alongside the geology, no confirmed tools, pottery, settlements, or any other trace of an organized culture from that supposed 9,000 BCE construction window has ever been found anywhere on the Giza Plateau. So this is not a settled scientific fact overturning Egyptology. It is a genuine, decades-old argument between a minority of geologists who trust what the erosion patterns look like, and a majority of archaeologists who trust what the surrounding context tells them, and the two sides have never been reconciled. This is the exact stalemate that people started handing to artificial intelligence. The appeal is obvious once you think about it. A machine has no career writing on the answer. It has not spent 30 years publishing papers that would need quiet revision if the stone turned out to be older than expected. It does not attend Egyptological conferences or worry about tenure. So the pitch, repeated across a wave of videos and posts in the last couple of years, goes like this. Feed Grok the erosion surveys, the laser scans of the enclosure walls, the paleoclimate reconstructions of the Sahara stretching back tens of thousands of years, the seismic data from underneath the monument, including a real 1992 seismic and ground-penetrating radar survey conducted by geophysicist Thomas Dobecki, alongside Robert Schoch, which did detect anomalous features consistent with possible cavities beneath the Sphinx's paws, features that have never been excavated or independently confirmed since and remain one of the plateau's genuinely open questions rather than a proven chamber, and ask the model to weigh the weathering as pure geometry rather than opinion. It is important to be honest with you here. There is no verified, peer-reviewed record of Grok formally running this exact analysis and issuing a specific numerical confidence score. The precise framing, a tidy percentage attached to rainfall erosion, is the kind of dramatic detail that spreads fast online without a traceable source behind it, and you should treat any specific number attached to it with real skepticism. What is true, and what these videos are really repackaging, is that the underlying comparison a language model would be doing, running the measured groove depth and curvature against known erosion profiles for wind, salt, and rain, is exactly the same comparison Schoch and other geologists have already made by hand using instruments on site. When you strip away the theater of asking a chatbot, the actual scientific question underneath it is real, still unresolved, and still worth taking seriously on its own terms. Now look at the head. Stand in front of the Sphinx, and most visitors notice it without being able to say why it looks slightly wrong. A small head sitting on top of an enormous, sprawling lion's body that takes up the space of a city block. This is not an illusion of perspective. Egyptologists themselves acknowledge the head is out of proportion with the body, smaller than you would expect if a sculptor had carved the whole figure from a single unified plan. Robert Schoch has argued that this mismatch exists because the current human face was recarved, likely during Khafre's own reign, cut back from an earlier, larger, and by then already weathered head, possibly an animal head, which would explain both the odd scale and the fact that the head shows a different, drier weathering pattern than the deeply rain-grooved body and enclosure walls below it. If you allow yourself to imagine for a moment what that original larger head might have looked like restored to match the body's proportions, the obvious candidate, given that the body is unmistakably a reclining lion, is simply a correctly scaled lion's head. A complete lion, nose to tail, rather than a lion's body wearing a human face. And that idea connects directly to the strangest argument in this entire debate, the sky itself. The Sphinx faces due east, precisely toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox. That alignment has been measured and confirmed independently many times over. But the sky is not a fixed backdrop. Earth's axis wobbles slowly over a cycle of roughly 25,920 years, called the precession of the equinoxes, which means the constellation rising just behind the sun on the equinox horizon slowly shifts over the centuries, moving through the 12 zodiac constellations at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years, spending roughly 2,160 years in front of each one. Run that cycle backward, and there is a specific window, roughly between 10,500 and 8,000 years before the present, sometimes called the astrological age of Leo, when the constellation of the Lion would have risen directly on the equinox horizon at dawn, in the exact direction the Sphinx has always faced. This connection was proposed formally in 1996 by author Graham Hancock and engineer Robert Bauval in their book The Message of the Sphinx, building on Bauval's earlier and separately controversial work, linking the layout of the 3 Giza pyramids to the 3 stars of Orion's belt, and arguing that a lion-shaped monument facing due east only makes complete symbolic sense if it was built to mark the age when a lion actually rose there in the sky. It is a genuinely striking coincidence of geometry and mythology, and it is also, like Schoch's redating, not accepted by mainstream Egyptology, which points out that a monument's orientation toward the equinox sunrise does not require or prove that its builders were consciously encoding a 25,000-year astronomical cycle, rather than simply choosing an obvious cardinal direction shared by many ancient structures around the world. If you follow this fringe interpretation further, though, and treat the Sphinx as one marker in a wider pattern, the trail leads to some genuinely extraordinary, well-documented archaeological sites. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is real, excavated, and dated by radiocarbon analysis to between roughly 9,500 and 8,000 BCE, making it the oldest known monumental stone structure on Earth, predating Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years and predating even the invention of pottery and farming in the region. Its massive carved limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons apiece, are arranged in large stone circles and decorated with detailed reliefs of foxes, boars, scorpions, and vultures, and were raised by hunter-gatherers who, under the conventional model of how civilization develops, should not have had the organization, food surplus, or division of labor to build anything like it. One of the recovered pillar fragments, a carved limestone head now known as Urfa Man, and dated to roughly the same period, is considered among the oldest known naturalistic sculptures of a human being anywhere in the world. Strangely, and this part is also well documented by the excavation team originally led by the late archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the people who built it apparently buried the entire site deliberately sometime around 8,000 BCE, backfilling it with rubble for reasons that remain genuinely unexplained, an act some researchers have described as a kind of intentional decommissioning rather than abandonment. Thousands of miles away in Peru sits Sacsayhuaman, above the city of Cusco, once believed to be a Quilque fortress and later expanded under the Inca into what is now generally understood to have served as both a defensive structure and a ceremonial site, tied to Inca religious festivals. Its enormous polygonal limestone blocks, some individually estimated to weigh well over 100 tons, are fitted together with such precision that even a thin blade cannot be slid between them using no mortar at all, a level of stone fitting that modern engineers still find difficult to fully explain using the tools historically credited to the Inca. And back in England, Stonehenge, whose main construction phase is generally dated to around 3000 BCE, carries confirmed solar alignments along its horizon studied for decades by archaeoastronomers, with some of its smaller bluestones traced through detailed geological fingerprinting to specific quarry outcrops in the Preseli Hills of Wales, roughly 180 miles from the monument itself. A transport feat that remains impressive even under the fully conventional timeline archaeologists accept for the site. None of these 3 sites are secret or fabricated. They are real, they are excavated, and they are genuinely remarkable. What is far more speculative and belongs firmly in the territory of alternative history rather than mainstream archaeology is the claim that they were all built according to one shared master template by a single lost global civilization communicating across oceans and millennia. Mainstream archaeologists explain the appearance of monumental building in roughly the same broad window after the last ice age as a natural consequence of the ice retreating, climates stabilizing, and separate human populations independently discovering agriculture, surplus food, and organized labor around the same general period, not evidence of one shared original source. It is also true, and this is the part that gives the alternative theory its emotional power, that the era when all of these sites cluster sits right beside one of the most violent climate events in the geological record, a period called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was real and remains one of the most dramatic climate reversals ever recorded, a sudden and severe return to ice age conditions across the northern hemisphere that struck with startling speed after a long warming trend, and that ended just as abruptly roughly 11,700 years ago. In North America, the large ice age mammals that had dominated the continent for tens of thousands of years, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, collapsed into extinction right around this same boundary, and the human Clovis culture, known for its distinctive fluted stone spear points, also appears to vanish from the archaeological record at almost exactly the same moment. In 2007, a research team led by nuclear chemist Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing that this abrupt cooling, dated to around 10,135 BCE, was triggered by a cosmic impact, a comet or fragmented swarm of comet debris striking the ice sheet covering North America. Their evidence included a distinctive layer found at numerous sites across North America and parts of Europe, containing nanodiamonds, shocked quartz grains, and tiny glassy spherules formed under extreme heat, all concentrated at exactly this boundary layer and largely absent from the sediment immediately above and below it. A follow-up study published in the Journal of Geology in 2018 documented a widespread platinum anomaly at this same Younger Dryas boundary across many North American sediment cores and ice records, platinum being useful as an impact marker because it is exceptionally rare in Earth's crust but far more common in certain classes of asteroid and comet material, the same reasoning scientists use to identify the far older impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs. It is important to say clearly that this Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains genuinely contested within the scientific community. It has real credentialed supporters who consider the platinum and nanodiamond evidence compelling, and it has real credentialed critics, some of whom have published detailed rebuttals arguing that no confirmed impact crater has ever been found for this event, that the elevated platinum could plausibly come from ordinary micrometeorite dust rather than a single large impactor, and that the anomalies can potentially be explained by other non-cosmic processes such as volcanic activity or changes in ocean circulation. Some skeptical geologists have gone as far as calling the whole hypothesis a failed one, arguing that 14 years of searching has still not produced the one thing a real impact of that scale should leave behind, a confirmed crater. Supporters respond that an impact onto a mile-thick ice sheet rather than bare rock might never leave a crater that survives to the present day at all, since the ice itself would have absorbed and then melted away the physical scar within a few thousand years. It has not been resolved into scientific consensus in either direction, but it is a real, published, ongoing scientific debate, not an internet invention, and it does describe a genuinely catastrophic climate shock landing at almost exactly the same window that Göbekli Tepe first appears in the archaeological record, and that Hancock and Bauval's astronomical dating places the symbolic origin of the Sphinx. That overlap is where the more speculative interpretation takes its final leap, the idea that survivors of a shattered, more advanced pre-catastrophe culture, scattered and reduced by a global disaster, left behind fragments of older knowledge in the monuments that came after, with coastlines where a maritime population might once have lived now, sitting under more than 100 meters of ocean, submerged permanently as ice age glaciers melted and sea levels rose over the following millennia, placing any direct physical evidence of such a culture beyond the reach of conventional land-based archaeology entirely. It is a genuinely compelling idea, and it is the same idea that authors like Hancock have built entire careers popularizing, but you should hold it exactly where it belongs, as an unproven, actively disputed hypothesis rather than an established fact, sitting alongside, not replacing, the well-evidenced mainstream account of Khafre's workers carving a guardian for his tomb around 2500 BCE. So where does that leave the actual answer to the question in the title? Honestly, it leaves it exactly where it has sat for more than 3 decades, unresolved, and that is precisely why the debate refuses to die. The mainstream case for Khafre is strong, contextual, and grounded in matching quarries, matching temples, and a documented royal restoration 1,000 years later. The fringe case for a vastly older sphinx rests on genuinely strange erosion patterns that do resemble sustained rainfall more than wind or salt, on a real disproportion between an oversized body and an undersized head, and on a real striking astronomical alignment to a lion-shaped constellation rising at dawn during a specific 10,000-year-old window. Feeding all of that into an artificial intelligence does not settle any of it. Because a language model can only ever weigh the same measurements a geologist could weigh by hand, it cannot walk out into the desert and independently discover a lost city, a hidden cave of tools, or a body of undiscovered waterborne sediment that would prove which story is true. What it can do, and arguably all it has ever really done in any of these viral videos, is restate the existing argument back to us in a cleaner, more confident-sounding voice. And that confidence is worth being suspicious of, not comforted by. There is one more thread worth pulling before we close, because it explains why this particular argument refuses to stay buried the way so many other ancient mysteries eventually do. Most contested archaeological claims fade because they rely on a single disputed artifact, one strange tablet, one blurry photograph, one bone that might or might not be what someone claims. The Sphinx is different. Here, the disputed evidence is the monument itself, sitting in plain view of every tourist, every satellite, and every laser scanner that has ever been pointed at Giza. Nobody has to dig anywhere to check it. The erosion channels are there right now, permanently open to inspection, which means every few years a new geologist, a new engineer, or now a new artificial intelligence walks up, looks at the same grooves that troubled Schwaller de Lubitsch in 1961, and has to decide for themselves what they are looking at. That is precisely why the story keeps regenerating instead of dying out like so many other claims. The evidence never goes away. It just keeps waiting for the next set of eyes. The Sphinx itself has not moved and has not changed. It sat through the fall of the Old Kingdom, through the New Kingdom Pharaoh who dug it out of the sand and left a stone tablet describing his dream, through Napoleon's soldiers and 19th century archaeologists and 21st century laser scanners, and it is still sitting there right now in the Egyptian sun, facing due east, waiting for whichever question we ask it next. Maybe the truest thing anyone has said about it is also the simplest. It has never hidden anything. It has just been waiting for someone, human or otherwise, to finally ask the right question and be honest enough to admit when the stone still refuses to give a clean answer. So here's what I want to know from you. If Robert Schoch is right, and those grooves really were carved by rain that fell thousands of years before Khafre was ever born, what does that mean for everything else we think we know about when civilization actually began? And if he is wrong, why has this argument survived every attempt to bury it for more than 30 years, outliving the careers of nearly everyone who first argued about it in that San Diego conference room back in 1991? Tell me your honest read in the comments and subscribe, because there are more of these unresolved mysteries being investigated right now, older sites and stranger alignments, and you will want to be here when the next piece of the story comes back.